FWC presenter, Corey Anderson.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning. I'm going to share some of the aquatic habitat conservation and restoration projects being conducted by FWC within Charlotte Harbor and the CHNEP program area. Next slide, please. FWC's Division of Habitat and Species Conservation, Aquatic Habitat Conservation and Restoration Section, or AHCR, manages publicly owned or publicly accessible fish and aquatic wildlife habitats to promote natural functions, improve habitat conditions, and ensure the long-term sustainability of fish and wildlife resources that depend on these systems. AHCR staff accomplish projects with funds from license sales and equipment sales of hunting and fishing gear, special license plate registrations like the Save a Manatee license plate, special initiatives such as the Amendment 1 to Florida's Constitution, the Florida Water and Land Conservation Amendment, also grants and cooperative agreements. And I'll invite you to visit the web address listed here towards the bottom of the slide to gain access to details about additional projects which have been completed around the state. And we also have interactive maps which explain our GIS-based resource prioritization of freshwater lakes, streams, and wetlands. And we use this to explain our support for investments in Florida's aquatic habitats. And a sneak peek is we have a marine and estuarine habitat prioritization coming later this year. Next slide, please. AHCR section projects vary in methodology. Generally, we take a systems and a landscape level approach to habitat enhancement for wildlife, meaning our biologists work on addressing underlying causes of impairments. And we're divided up into two basic sections. We have the Aries section, the aquatic habitat freshwater folks, and then folks who are marine biologists in the MESI section. For example, I'll give you some of the things that we've done here to address poor quality stream habitat. In the lower left image, we improved this stream by decreasing sedimentation by using bank stabilization methods. In the center image there, we tried to address declining red drum juvenile populations in Northeast Florida by restoring dragline ditched salt marsh nursery habitats and providing extra wetlands for them to feed and grow in. And then in the Indian River Lagoon on the right-hand side, we looked at the lack of oyster settlement substrate and oyster habitat and enhanced that using volunteers to place shell where it had once been mined out of the estuary for things like roadbed fill. Our habitat projects range from lake and impoundment enhancement, stream restoration, and working in forested and non-forested wetlands. And quite interesting is some of the work in ephemeral wetlands, which are quite important for amphibians. And we also do marine and estuarine projects such as salt marsh and mangrove restoration, working in seagrass beds to restore scars and blowholes, reestablishing oyster reefs, and hard bottom and coral reef enhancement in Southeast Florida. Within the CHNEP program area, FWC and our partners, we're also really big on partnering, have completed and have ongoing salt marsh, mangrove, oyster, and manatee warm water refuge habitat projects. Next slide, please. First one I'd like to tell you about is at Don Pedro Island State Park Land Base on Lemon Bay, which became a state park in 1991. Next, please. A canal had been dredged and spoiled onto a salt marsh sometime in the 1960s, indicated by the arrow, impairing about 2.8 acres of habitat with a large berm of sediment 900 feet long, 12 feet high, and 120 feet wide. Next, please. Beginning in 2016 and continuing through this year, FWC partnered with Florida State Parks and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Coastal Program to restore tidal wetland hydrology, recreate fish and wildlife habitat where it once existed, allow for salt marsh migration upslope, and control invasive exotic plants through their removal and preparing the park for prescribed fire rotation. The project outline is down in the very corner on the bottom in red. And I'll note that this map has north at the top, But in the following slides, north in the images will be on the right-hand side, so you'll actually be looking west. Next slide, please. So in this slide, the image shows the unrestored spoil berm and canal. So the canal is there on the left. The systems restoration approach we used was called ecological mangrove rehabilitation, and that was coined by the late Robin Lewis. What we did is set the restored area to the desired intertidal elevations, and then employed other techniques used by Melinda Donnelly and Linda Walters, installing salt marsh plants to stabilize the soil, and then trap mangrove propagules. So then we created a successional salt marsh, which had naturally occurring mangroves growing into it. We then monitored this for plant health community for the next 2 years. Next slide, please. This slide shows a video of the site after the excavation and hauling away of all that spoil material that came from the canal. You can see the bare ground there before we were replanting it. We successfully created about 2.8 acres of new marsh and restored freshwater wetland flow to the estuary and flatwood and hammock plant communities over 68 acres of the rest of the park through removing exotic plants. Planning for this project was a little tricky because of nearby nesting bald eagles, so we set up a 660-foot buffer to work around them and worked after the nesting season mostly. A gopher tortoise was also setting up shop in our spoil berm, and we had to relocate it into the park using an on-site take permit as part of the spoil removal. And you can see Lemon Bay in the background of the video there. Next slide, please. So the final video here shows the restored marsh 1 year after the restoration and replanting. In all, we had about 21,600 plants installed, including almost 10,000 by volunteers who were kind enough to contribute 99 people hours. We installed native species such as cordgrasses, mangroves, saltwort, needle rush, and dropseed, and we had a lot of natural recruitment of mangroves. The area filled in over the last 2 years to over 80% plant coverage, providing great habitat for wading birds and lots of those forage fish species which drive productivity in the harbor, including millions of hermit crabs that live in there. Some interesting issues that we ran into included Hurricane Irma, which destabilized the marsh surface before it was fully planted out and caused a lot of erosion into the canal. But I'm happy to report that this has been cleaned up and the canal dredged back to its pre-hurricane depths. The hydrology was improved overall by creating some tidal creeks, which you could see there in the video, and this has allowed greater water flow into the wetland and better hydrology. Next slide, please. The next project we worked on was in May of 2018 when FWC partnered with Lee County, West Coast Inland Navigation District, and Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation on a large-scale oyster restoration project that they had going in San Carlos Bay and Matlacha Pass. Next slide, please. The images show the oyster reef in question from 1995. Next, please. Then 2017 and pre-construction survey. Next, please. And 2019, next please, and show how the reef lost a lot of shell material due to erosion, wind waves, storms, and die-off of the adult oysters. Then restored it on the western side, which can be seen in the pink, and then circle, next please. Years of shell loss at these intertidal reefs in Carlos Bay led to degraded oyster populations and the inability of reefs to sustain new oysters and keep pace with sea level rise. Whole, clean fossil shell, you know, the things that come out of mines that could be 10-inch conch shells or huge 8-inch clam shells, we're able to place these on the reef footprint to 1 acre and stabilize the reef for new oysters to recruit. These large fossilized calcified shells provide a really stable base that doesn't roll around the surf. Next, please. At this oyster reef in San Carlos Bay, we placed 750 yards, cubic yards, trucks worth of shell, which were carried from the mine in Punta Gorda cleanly on this reef, which is just west of Starvation Key. You can see wildlife immediately started using of the state-threatened American oyster catcher, which took to it right away. Next slide, please. This project is targeted directly at enhancing manatee habitat. So this spring run in the city of Northport flows into Warm Mineral Springs Creek, and then converges. As you can see in the images on extensive terrestrial and aquatic alteration as far back as the 1940s, drained the wetlands from Salt Creek, and residential lots were constructed in the 1950s. By 1969, Salt Creek was expanded and drained the wetlands to the north, and residential communities and infrastructure expanded, degrading creek habitats and habitat for wolf. Next, please. Warm Mineral Springs is important because it originates from a head spring at 85 degrees, and multiple deep pools along the middle stretch are habitat for threatened Florida manatee. Over 100 manatees have been documented in Warm Mineral Springs as a refuge during the winter. So this is largely the most important natural manatee refuge in Southwest Florida. Erosion has caused shoaling that restricts manatee access. In the image on the left here, see the tide gauge in the Myakka River, showing that about a 4 feet difference between low and high tide. And in the winter, when nor'easter winds blow water out of the system, shoals can make it impossible for manatee and access the warm water refuge. At times, hundreds of manatees have been seen congregating outside of Salt Creek, waiting for water level to rise so they can get into the habitat. On the lower right, you can even see a manatee which was stranded and needed cold stress when they're exposed to frigid winter air temperatures, and they may even die from this exposure. So the long-term objective of this project is to restore access for manatees. Next, please. To achieve our project goals, we've worked on dredging and coming up with a plan for restoring volume to the warm water habitat, including devising a hydraulic channel model and identifying locations where we can and can't improve manatee habitat access and the ability to restore natural riparian vegetation to provide them refuge and cover. This project is ongoing and should be in the permitting stages this year, later of 2020. Next, please. I'd like to thank many of our funding and project partners here. Of course, there are many others that we've worked with, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Coastal Heartland NEP, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, Mosaic Foundation, and others have been important. With that, next slide, please. I'll leave you with our contact information, and we can take questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey. First, I just want to say I apologize. We at the CHNEP have been working feverishly to try to restore Minty. We even copied the whole thing over and started a new one. It does not appear to be working. It's something on their end, and we've put in a notice to Minty, but we're waiting to hear back. So in the interim, we're going to have to go to Plan B, which is just to enter your questions in the chat online through Zoom. And I apologize to those of you who are watching through YouTube. You see Corey and Maria's information right here. Make sure to take it down and email them your questions directly. Right now, we're looking for questions for those of you who are participating online through Zoom. If you wouldn't mind entering those now in the chat field. And Corey, as you see those pop up, feel free to go ahead and read those aloud and respond to them.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if my audio had been cutting out during the presentation. Again, feel free to contact me using this email address afterwards if you have additional questions. First question I see, it's great to see oyster restoration. What caused oyster declines and what is being done to address those problems to ensure the restoration is successful? So overharvest is one cause of oyster declines. Another is poor water quality. And these oyster reefs in particular are near the mouth of the Caloosahatchee. One thing that's being done to address those declines from poor water quality discharges from the Caloosahatchee is the updated Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, which will help improve salinity conditions for oysters. Also, the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation has a landscape level approach by creating many oyster reefs throughout the estuary, and I'm sure Eric Milbrandt will be talking to that later. Next question I see is, can we purchase coastal aquatic plants to plant around private docks in Lemon Bay? You can purchase coastal aquatic plants, and you may be able to plant them around your own shoreline if you do own the shoreline. You can plant mangroves and other things. I would direct you to the Florida Association of Native Nurseries to find a nursery in your area that can help you not only identify what you can plant, but also locate the right plant in the right place. Next question I see is a Northport resident who is happy to see the work plan for Warm Mineral Springs and Salt Creek. Will volunteers be asked to participate at some point? It's possible. There have been some local cleanup days back before the current pandemic situation that we are in, and they did utilize volunteers. It is foreseeable that we will be having additional cleanup days out there in the future. And the city of Northport or Sarasota County Parks and Recreation may be looking for volunteers at that point. Currently, most agencies are not taking volunteers because of the health situation. The next question is, has anyone studied if fossil oyster shells are more or less effective than modern oyster shells for maintaining healthy oyster beds? There have been several studies that look at the settlement rates of oysters on both recycled oyster shell and fossil oyster shell. The study results are variable, and I will say that in general, they are pretty comparable, but there is more settlement on the heavier shell that lasts longer. That's the last question I had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corey. We really appreciate that. Now we're moving on to the next presentation by SCCF.